Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Next on the programme, how do you define sexual consent and how do you demonstrate someone has agreed to have sex with you? This week, the Crown Prosecutions Service is launching a social media campaign called #ConsentIs, encouraging people to talk about what consent means to them. The Crown Prosecutions Service, or CPS, decides which criminal cases should be prosecuted in England and Wales and presents them in court. To try to clarify the circumstances in which alleged rapists can be prosecuted, the CPS released new guidelines saying that staying silent or using contraception doesn't mean someone has consented to sex. This week they're launching that campaign to highlight the issue, featuring various videos like this.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Yes, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please. That's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, "But you wanted tea last week." Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, "But you wanted tea last night." But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Well, let's talk now to Alison Saunders, who is the Director of Public Prosecutions and runs the CPS. And obviously the kind of conversation we're going to have will be pretty frank and direct, and you might not want children in the room with you. Good morning to you, Alison Saunders.
Morning.
Is sex without consent rape?
Yes.
Simple as that?
Yes. For sexual intercourse to happen, you should have consent and both parties should be consenting.
And when you say you should have consent, in the eyes of the law, tell us what sort of onus there is on the man, usually the man, to demonstrate that a woman has consented.
I mean, we talk about it being the man, but of course that's the usual thing, but it could be the other way around. What you need to make sure is that somebody has free will, so they're able to give consent, that they know what they're doing, and also that the one who is instigating the sex, so whether it be a man or a lady, has a reasonable belief, so they understand. We need to know why they think that consent may have been given. So it's possibly not quite as straightforward as signing a contract, and that's not what we're talking about. It's about understanding that this is a consensual experience, that both parties want it to happen, and both parties are agreeing to do exactly what happens.
Obviously, the basis of our legal system is innocent until proven guilty. This sounds like it's guilty until you can prove you're innocent.
No, and that's absolutely not. We're not changing anything about the burden of proof. So it remains you are innocent until proven guilty. So which is why it's important for us to be able to get the right evidence to show either that it was very obvious that consent wasn't being given, so the normal type of thing that people understand, being dragged off the street, but much more subtly, if somebody is saying they've been in a relationship but they say no on a particular instance, no means no. Or if somebody consents to a certain type of sex but a different type of sex happens, again, that could be rape. So it's much more nuanced than just a yes or a no sometimes.
Yes, and the absence of a no doesn't mean yes.
Absolutely.
Why this shift then to put the onus on the man, usually the man?
Well, it's not putting the onus on, it's about really explaining what consent is about, because there seems to be a complete misconception about what is consent, what needs to happen for consensual intercourse to take place. So really this is about being open and transparent, getting people to understand why we prosecute cases and where people may be at jeopardy of going over into a sort of unlawful act rather than a lawful act.
You're launching this campaign alongside the National Union of Students. Is it a particular problem on student campuses?
I think because of Freshers' Week, everyone's very excited, people away from home. Some people may not have experienced the sort of freedom that they now have. I think it's good that people are clear about it and that there's a conversation that people can have about what is and isn't consent, so there's a really clear understanding.
I want to give you a couple of scenarios in a moment, but we went to talk to some students to ask what they thought consent meant. Here's what they had to say.
I know a lot of my friends have kind of gone back with people when they're drunk, woken up and not really remembered anything particularly. So then there's issues there of kind of establishing what was done and if they were okay with it. And the problem then becomes, well, then whose kind of fault was it? Because if two people are in a scenario where you're kind of both as drunk as each other and nothing's and you don't really remember what's been said, and in worst case scenario don't really remember what's been done, it's very, very hard.
I do think that it's a positive shift away from the idea of victim blaming and making the onus of proof on the victim.
Sex is or sexual activity is a mutual thing, because I think it's saying, you know, it's up to the man, it's all on the man, it's kind of nothing to do with you, you're just kind of the body, and that's it, and it's all the onus is on the man. I think that's completely wrong.
I think men need to take responsibility for learning what good consent is and spreading that to other people and trying to make sure the message carries on.
I've got friends who I know who have woken up the next morning and been like, well, I don't know what went on. I know I was happily getting with him earlier in the evening. I can't therefore say yes or no whether I consented later on. I'm not going to do anything about it, but that doesn't mean it sits comfortably with them and it's not still on their mind and not something that still bothers them at a later date. If you're both drunk and nobody else was around and nobody's got recollection of the night, actually that's going to be really hard to prove.
The law already at the moment has kind of things about you have to have the capacity and the capability to consent, and if you are so wasted that you won't remember it the next morning, then you're not really in a position where you can say yes or no to anything really, and so I think that's already in the law.
I think it's an interesting movement going from moving to one where they're saying actually you're guilty unless kind of proven otherwise, as far as the guy that you've got to prove that consent was given, otherwise we're going to consider it to be rape or whatever is going on. But how do you prove that?
As a man, I already assume that it is kind of the onus is on me when I'm having kind of engaging in sex with people, that I'm making sure that their consent, that it's just something that I would do, and I'd hope that other people were, but obviously that's not happening in every circumstance.
So let's pick up that scenario that was raised by a couple of students. Two people are really drunk, they're not unconscious, both think the other consented, and in the morning, for example, the woman wakes up, has no recollection of consenting and thinks she might have been raped.
That's a really difficult one. Consent has to be sort of given, but equally there has to be an offence there. So if they can't remember what's happened, I think in that case, if I were the woman, I might go to a support group and ask for some help and talk it through with somebody. If you've got, as the clip there quite rightly said, if you've got somebody who is so incapacitated that they can't give consent, then the law is very clear there, and there has been case law that that would be an offence.
So that's interesting. If a woman isn't sure if she consented, she might have done, she might not, you're saying she shouldn't make a complaint to the police?
I'm saying that she should think about it, and she should maybe talk to some support groups. If she thinks that there may have been an offence, then she should certainly talk to the police. But I think you need to, it's not as simple as what happened. If people can't remember, they need to, it's each circumstances of each case that we would look at.
Yes.
So it's very difficult to give a sort of definitive answer.
And that's fair enough. But you can, obviously, you can see then in some scenarios it's nigh on impossible for a man to kind of prove his innocence. And although they're few and far between, some women do make false claims of rape, don't they?
Well, it's not for the man to prove his innocence, it's for us to prove his guilt. So we would look at that first and decide whether there is sufficient evidence to take before the court. But people may not understand quite what has happened, which is where it may help them to look at some of the support groups, talk to some support help that is out there. We've got links from our campaign through to support groups, so people can go and sort of talk it through first to see, are they in that scenario where they want to go to the police and make a complaint? But certainly I would encourage anyone who has any thought that they may have been raped, that they weren't capable of consenting, then they should really go to the police.
Yes, if they weren't capable of consenting, that is clear. But let me put this to you. One columnist in The Independent wrote, "A woman can consent to sex, participate willingly and consciously, but if she wakes up and wishes she hadn't and can prove that she was drunk as a skunk at the time, she can now claim she was raped."
Well, that's very different, because what we're not saying is just because you are drunk means you can't consent. And again, the law's clear. It depends on the sort of level of capacity. So we would normally sort of look at other evidence about, actually how drunk was someone. If you've got CCTV of someone falling out of a nightclub, completely incapacitated, they're not going to be able to give consent. If someone understands and just thinks in the morning that was a mistake, that's very different. And that's not the sort of case that we would look at. You've got to be able to prove you either had not given consent, or you were incapacitated, you didn't have the freedom to give consent, and also that the man, the perpetrator, didn't have a reasonable belief, so they didn't think you were giving consent. So again, it depends on the circumstances.
Sometimes people have sex without talking. No verbal communication. In those scenarios, how do you know if consent has been given?
Well, again, you would look at the circumstances. So in some cases, it may be that consent has been given, it's just not verbalised. So if you've been happily enjoying a relationship, you've been out, there's no reason to believe that consent wasn't given. In other scenarios, some people will have what we call a sort of freezing reaction. So where they just shut down because that's their defence mechanism. And I think that for one of the myths that we're trying to debunk in the sort of campaign is that that's not giving consent sometimes. It is about self-defence mechanism. So if you are in a situation where it's obvious consent couldn't have been given, but you just shut down, that doesn't mean to say you're giving consent. It is just a self-defence mechanism.
Right, okay. Let me ask you if you have any sympathy with, again, usually men, who genuinely thought a woman had consented, and halfway through sex she says no, and he doesn't think she means no.
I mean, I think this is where you get into very complicated territory, and it can be very difficult. But if at some point a woman says no, that's it. It means no. So you have to listen to your partner. In consensual intercourse, you should be sort of engaging in a good experience where you're in tune with each other and you understand. So if somebody articulates no, then you stop.
And what you're saying is consent can be withdrawn at any point in sexual activity.
Absolutely. I mean, as the teacup video was showing you, it's, if you understand that analogy, it's very clear. You don't keep pouring the tea when somebody says no.
Ken Clarke, when he was Justice Secretary, was criticised for saying there were different degrees of rape, different levels of seriousness, if you like. Was he right?
I think if you talk to victims of rape, no matter what the circumstances are, and you understand the impact that it can have on them, I think they feel that whatever their experience was, it was just as traumatic. So I think it's what they think about it, which is really important.
There was a retired judge who said last year that rape trials are difficult when the complainant was drunk at the time of the alleged offence because their evidence can be unreliable. Is that fair?
I think what we're really keen to do is debunk a lot of these myths. So when people freeze, if people have been wearing sort of certain types of clothing, if people have been drinking, it is not their fault. They don't become...
well, it might be their fault, but it's not a crime.
Yes, exactly.
They may have chosen to drink those drinks or wear those clothes.
Well, you shouldn't blame them because of that. That's what I mean, sorry. Yeah. So it's really clear that these are myths and stereotypes where people have felt that somehow they were to blame because of that. They're not. You know, people are allowed to go out and drink, people are allowed to go out and wear clothing, and they shouldn't then become victims.
But the point that the judge was making, the retired judge, was that the evidence can be unreliable. Maybe that is fair.
Well, I know if you've been drinking, sometimes, you may have an unclear recollection, but most people have a recollection of what's happened. So again, it depends on the individual, it depends on the evidence. It's really hard to generalise in these types of cases.
Okay. Well, thank you for trying though. Can I ask you about some other issues? In particular, cases where people who've been accused of a crime are kept on bail for very long periods of time, many months and in some cases years, while your organisation decides whether to charge them or not. Do you accept that justice delayed is justice denied?
Absolutely, but I'd also question whether or not people are on bail for years while we decide. I don't think that is the case. We're very clear that we will try and make decisions as quickly as possible, and in many of the recent cases that have been talked about publicly, we have made decisions within at least a month, if not sooner than that. So there has to be an investigation. The cases have to come to us. Quite often, if they're complicated, we quite rightly need to make sure that we have the evidence there. It's important for the individual who is the suspect as well as for those who are the victims or witnesses, and we need to make sure we make the right decision, but we will do that as quickly as possible because quite rightly, as you say, people, I can understand people will feel extremely stressed and under pressure while they are waiting a decision.
Paul Gambaccini was kept on bail for a year. He was on the programme last week describing it as psychological torture.
And I can imagine it must have been really difficult for him. We made the decision in that case in less than a month.
But he was re-bailed constantly over a 12-month period. You're saying that's nothing to do with you, that's down to the police?
I'm saying the investigation has to take place. We had the case and made the decision on whether or not to prosecute within a month.
Do you accept that the length of time it is taking, the investigation plus the decision that you make, is ruining some people's lives? And it's not necessarily the allegations against them that's ruining their lives, but because the investigations are taking so long. I
can really appreciate how difficult it must be if you're on bail, you're waiting for a decision.
Can you?
Well, I can understand it from what people have said, and waiting that sort of decision, whether you're a suspect or a victim or a witness, must be really difficult. So it is right that we try and make it as quickly as possible. And there are certainly...
But the accusation is you're not making it as quickly as possible.
Well, I think we are. I think making a decision within a month is a really good timescale. You don't want us to rush it and get it wrong. It's important for everyone involved that we get it right. And I think making a decision in a complex case where there's been a lengthy investigation within a month or just over that in some cases is actually a pretty good demonstration of our commitment to make those decisions quickly.
Can I ask you about the Scotland Yard investigation into an alleged Westminster paedophile ring? At the time, the police said one of the alleged victims that his claims were credible and true. They're now acknowledging that effectively by saying that they were preempting the outcome of the investigation. Do you think they overstepped the mark by saying the claims were credible and true?
I haven't seen anything, so I don't know exactly what they were basing
what they said,
that on.
And that's what they're now saying.
They are now saying quite rightly, I think, that in order to launch an investigation, there had to be credible evidence. They perhaps have acknowledged, I think they've acknowledged today, that they've overstepped the mark in saying it might have been true. It's a very difficult balance. People won't come forward. When we've talked to victims and witnesses, one of the things they say they fear most is being judged and disbelieved. but it is absolutely our job and the police's job to investigate and to decide whether there is sufficient evidence to put before a court.
Sure.
You don't just take somebody's word as it is.
But they said that the claims were true. I mean, that's for a jury to decide if it ever gets that far.
Absolutely for a jury to decide.
Are you aware that some of the Scotland Yard investigations into that alleged paedophile ring have been dropped?
No, I'm not. We haven't had a file through yet on that.
Okay. You were watching our investigation into the RSPCA. Do you think they have too much power in both investigating and prosecuting cases of animal cruelty?
I can only speak about us, really, rather than the RSPCA, and we don't have investigative powers. We work very closely with the police and we can advise them. And in some cases we have worked, because the RSPCA cases are effectively private prosecutions. So, and as you've seen from the clip, we have intervened in some cases and taken them over.
And a final thought, it's to do with the case of Lord Janner. You decided it wasn't in the public interest for him to stand trial over historic sex offences because of his ill health. That decision was overturned. Do you regret your original decision?
I've stood by the decision to prosecute. The case is now before the court, and it's a matter of sub judice, so obviously I can't talk about it. My decisions I don't take lightly. I think about them very carefully. And we have taken the decision to prosecute that case now.
You don't regret the original decision, though, clearly.
We are now prosecuting that case, so...
Thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you for
you.
coming on the programme. Alison Saunders, who is the Director of Public Prosecutions. Alison Saunders, Director of Public Prosecutions. Lara in Reading was watching Alison Saunders speak. Lara, what did you think?
Well, I think that hello, Victoria, I think that if both a man and a woman are out and they've both been drinking, and in the morning, you know, both of them can have some level of regret or even feel used in the morning, I feel that it's a bit unfair that the lady can then report this as having been, hadn't given consent if they can't remember. But on the other hand, the man in the case might end up being a victim, and, you know, for the same level of intoxication for both parties, one of them might end up being a victim and the other might end up being viewed as a criminal.
Right. You mean there's nowhere for the man to go if he feels violated?
Yes.
I mean, he could go to the police. It is unusual, but that avenue is open to him.
Well, maybe not necessarily if he feels violated, but if he feels equally that consent wasn't given, it wasn't sought, or he doesn't remember, or even if, you know, he feels a level of regret that I probably didn't want to engage in sexual relations with this lady, but, you know, they were both drunk. For the lady, it almost feels like there's a clear-cut avenue for what can happen, and if she goes and complains about this, then the man obviously is then being investigated for rape as a result of both of them being intoxicated to the same degree.
Lara, thank you very much for that. Thanks very much for coming on the programme. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.